Yeah, to set a little bit of background context for what I'm going to be talking about. So, yeah, my academic background is ecology, and ecology is the science of interconnection, and interconnection of living systems. And I think psychedelics, they might seem sort of very much kind of their own thing, but one of the core facets of the psychedelic experience is interconnection. So they allow this direct experiential comprehension of this interconnection, as opposed to just an intellectual understanding. So, we are in the 6th great mass extinction of life on planet Earth. The loss of species, of ecological degradation is unprecedented and accelerating, and 1 million or so species are threatened with extinction. The systems on which all life on Earth depend are being degraded and destroyed. And the essential sort of conclusion from this report is, without a sort of global mobilization, an ecological mobilization on the scale of World War II, we are in deep, deep trouble. A few interesting, more positive findings from this report. And one of the interesting things was that lands inhabited and sort of under the control of indigenous people were some of the only lands on Earth not undergoing ecological degradation of any kind. And this is really interesting in terms, these indigenous groups live very nature-connected lives. They're, of all the human beings alive, they have the strongest, deepest connection to their land. And it seems that connection, as I'll sort of discuss, fosters this care and this concern. These indigenous groups tend to sort of view themselves as part of their environment and their habitat. So why would you destroy your habitat when it's sort of going to destroy you? The scale of the disconnection, I mean, there's a lot of interacting factors here. When we started farming, we took a step away. We started to view nature as a resource and a commodity, something to extract from. We'd exclude other life from the bits that we were tending, or would kill predators from eating our livestock. And then we started moving into cities in the wake of agriculture and our domestication of grasses in particular. And then we took a further kind of step away from nature. And then the Abrahamic religions have a very anthropocentric view. The book of Genesis in the Bible clearly lays out that we're God's chosen children, and all the animals, all the plants are there to be used how we damn well see fit. And then the concept of dualism, that partly emerged from from Christianity, so it was like tainted with that we are God's chosen children views. We're the only beings that possess soul and mind. Animals are mere automatons that just sort of react to stimuli, but there's no flicker of consciousness or anything else going on. So essentially looking out at nature like it was this dead thing, which if you think about it is crazy. And then sort of more recent technological things, biodiversity loss. So there's a whole sort of interacting mix of factors, and because of that, I don't feel there's not a one-pot solution to pushing back against it. I mean, I think psychedelics could be helpful, but they're not a magic bullet. They're not a panacea. They're not sufficient to sort of like push back and turn the tide of that. And there needs to be like a broad scale of different kind of approaches in terms of nature restoration, restoring the ecosystems of which we've become a part, nature-based experiential education for the young, increasing equality, equity, and access of nature, potentially psychedelics as well, obviously, and sort of making nature connectedness, or like cultivating relationships with nature, a more sort of central priority. And this disconnection is occurring, manifesting on different scales. So disconnection from our core selves, disconnection from other people, disconnection from nature. In terms of the disconnection from nature, as soon as we moved away from being hunter-gatherers and became farmers, it fundamentally changed the way we interacted with and viewed nature. Nature became a resource to be tamed and controlled, certain species were prioritized over the existence of others. And that planted the seeds of our civilization as we know it today. But with that came increased urbanization, and more people were moving, becoming more sort of cut off from nature. But the most recent form of disconnection that seems to have occurred through technology, and particularly sort of like television and more recently the internet. And it seems, our screen addictions kind of render us prisoners of the paradox that the more we watch, the less we see of the world around us. Unfortunately, broadly speaking, in the Western world, nature connectedness is being eroded on a few fronts. This is coming through things such as urbanization and the loss of green space, biodiversity loss as well, loss of wildlife. These things are tied to what has been called an extinction of experience. So a diminished capacity for everyday interactions with nature, with non-human life. So why be interested in nature connectedness? Why is this important? To put it very simply, it feels good and it's good for us to connect with nature. And there's a fairly solid and growing body of research finding a particularly strong link between nature connectedness and eudaimonic well-being, which is well-being centered on life meaning and self-actualization. And one study published a few years ago looked at various different nature-based things in people's lives and other things as well. So visits to nature, watching nature documentaries, visits to local green space. And it found that people's nature connectedness had 4 times the predictive power of their well-being than socioeconomic status. Another study, separate to this, found that nature connectedness had as strong an association with happiness as socioeconomic status. So it's been referred to as a basic psychological human need, and it's very much sort of tied to human flourishing. And this is interesting and important. Nature, I mean, there's a vast body of research literature and evidence now to show how important being in nature is for our health and well-being. Meaningful moments in nature beyond actual time spent in it are important for nature connectedness. But even 5-10 minutes in nature can affect our mood. Half an hour across the week can reduce levels of depression. 2 hours across the whole of a week seems to have quite important implications for our general health and well-being. So the possibility that people are choosing to spend more time in nature, have more contact with it as a result of their psychedelic experiences, that potentially has really quite vast implications for health and well-being across the lifespan.
Spirituality is about connecting to something bigger, something greater than the self. And that can obviously be a perceived transpersonal spiritual essence or like higher power God. But it could also just be, like nature and the universe. And I think, and the thing I kind of like about that is it's kind of like a grounded, tangible form of spirituality as well. It's not, you're not away with the fairies somewhere else. It's like here, now, earthy and grounded.
And you can literally touch it, feel it, smell it, sense it. And therefore it's really very grounding.
Literally, like we come from the earth and we go back to the earth. The mystery itself, you don't need to potentially, I don't think, subscribe to anything more beyond just than what's happening right now.
What would the forest tell you if you could hear her? What would you tell the forest, for she can hear you? Maybe growing up isn't as important as growing down.
Ways that our species and our ancestors, our human ancestors, were related to their natural environments were very different. Humans didn't have this superiority complex. They didn't deem to know better or to be above the other species, and truly regarded all other aspects of nature as fellow beings of equal value.
Animal or interspecies communication really is the term that's come to be used to describe the energetic transference of direct knowing and of shared experience. And usually the setup is that happens between two beings who are focused on each other and connecting in a state of empathy to be able to understand and really deeply understand each other.
If and when the mind is out of the way, what takes over is a seamless merging between myself and the other, really. So usually a communication involves a subject and an object, and I'm communicating with you. When the mind can fall really quiet and I'm just in a state of shared awareness or shared being with the other, the I and the you disappear. The seer and the seen disappear, and all that's left is seeing, the most beautiful state of seeing and mutual knowing. It's a mutual knowing. They know me as well as I know them in that moment, in a much more full way than linear time can even account for. And in 3 seconds of shared being with another, we can know each other fully, past, present, and future.
Yeah, that's what's quite interesting to me about nature connectedness, actually, is because, you know, part of it is kind of keying into one's awareness of being part of a larger interconnected web of life. And I guess for some people that might sound a bit hippie-ish and new agey, but it's really not. I mean, that is a basic bedrock tenet of the science of ecology, you know, which is all about the interconnection of living systems. You know, of course we are part of one interconnected system. It can't exist any other way. That is the fundamental sort of like truth of kind of what's going on. And then, you know, like we've evolved these egos, you know, over the course of evolution, and they, you know, they're concocted by the brain, and they make us feel separate and individual. And you know, there's good reasons for that. I mean, that's, you know, so we kind of like will survive and we'll pass on our genes, and you know, like, and it allows us lots of great opportunities and perspectives that come with that. But yeah, it's good to be reminded that, you know, however tangible that feeling of separation and individuality is, I think the closer, more objective truth is that, you know, we are just, you know, each of us are a single being that's like wedded in an interconnected mesh of other beings. And like, yeah, and I think as well, just extrapolating from that, like we're living in a very disconnected time, psychologically, not just from nature. I feel like our society, our civilization, the ideals of our civilization, you know, could be considered to be, are like pretty individualistic, pretty materialistic, competitive in some sense. And it's like those things are like what they could be considered to be inversely related to connectedness or connection. And I'm speaking now more widely than nature. I mean connectedness to self, connectedness to others, and connectedness to nature, the world, the universe. And, you know, so, and I feel like I don't want to like oversimplify and generalize too much, but I really do feel that like deep disconnection lies at the root of the mental health crisis we're going through, also the environmental crisis we're going through, and it's unfortunately woven into the very fabric of our societal ideals. And yeah, so that's a major bummer, you know, for all the definite good. And, you know, I'm not like, you know, I'm not saying tear down the, you know, society and like anarchy on the streets right now. Like, you know, I'm grateful for all the various, you know, we're all living longer, we have more opportunities, we have material comforts, access to medicines, all this stuff, and it's fantastic. And we're having this conversation now through this technology. It's great, but it's like, it seems that our kind of, I guess, existential psychological needs from our initial kind of how we used to exist as hunter-gatherer community. We've still got the brains of our Paleolithic ancestors from 200,000 years ago. Only we're like in this like we're kind of, what was it? There's a great quote from the late E.O. Wilson, who's this evolutionary biologist, something along the lines of like, we have the brains of our Paleolithic ancestors, we have medieval institutions and godlike
technology. Yeah,
and it's like, oh god, it's like the trinity of those things is like, it's a volatile old cocktail.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree with what you said regarding sort of like spirituality, or define it. For me, it's always felt like it's really an internal, like a sense of alignment. It's and so you can kind of feel when you are off, when you are sort of acting toxic and being a shit, and you can feel that way, and you can also feel when you're aligned, and whatever that is that you're aligned with, I think is up to the individual.
Yes.
Of the 17 of 20 people who responded to some degree to the psilocybin therapy, all independently described this feeling of disconnection as being part of their depression. And psilocybin worked in part by reconnecting them to themselves, to others, to the world at large. And it was interesting that none of these people undergoing the psilocybin therapy, none of them prior to their psilocybin session described this feeling of noticing or acknowledging they were disconnected from nature. It was only afterwards, during and afterwards, they sort of re-remembered the importance of that connection.
So this reconnection to nature, this is so profound and important. And people who don't experience this, they are truly missing out from my own experience. I really wouldn't want to not have it in my life. It's such a beautiful, nourishing connection.
In terms of what's going on with regards psychedelics making us more connected to nature, it seems to it's involved with the ego, the sense of self. So here, this image, which is part of the Imperial Beckley research program, is showing a sort of conceptualized representation of what's going on in the brain in terms of interconnection. So under an MRI. So under a high dose of psilocybin, your default mode network, which is considered to be a kind of fundamental neural component of the ego or the sense of self, is kind of relaxed and sort of dissolves. And that in turn facilitates this kind of expanded state of self-nature overlap. So it's worth kind of thinking about that psychedelics are agents of connection on all levels. On the level of the neuron, they induce synaptic and neurite formation. At the level of the brain, they increase global connectivity and communication of different parts of the brain. At the level of the self and interpersonally, they facilitate connection, as the depression research alludes to. They also increase connection to nature and the universe at large.
So you are zooming out of your current stress. When you dissociate from whatever causes you stress, you get back into your heart and you look at things from a distance, which gives you a new perspective, new insights. So it is a very simple method to help your nervous system to regulate itself. Go out into nature, connect with trees, Listen to the sounds. Let your hands feel and be present. Don't ruminate on your life's problems. Try to really be in the moment and enjoy what you see. Especially now, everything is so green and beautiful. And it's so harmonious. And you can just be in this natural environment. So having reconnected with nature, it gives me this inner peace and joy, which is a right hemisphere state.
Humor in adults is processed on the right side of the brain. The baby becomes securely attached to the psychobiologically attuned caregiver who minimizes negative affect, who downregulates negative affect by soothing the baby and maximizes positive affect, joy in the play state. For a long time, we thought that essentially the bond was there because she was down-regulating emotion. But we now know that as equally important is the mother's ability to upregulate joy states.
And you can experience that in nature, connecting with Mother Earth.
Of brain-to-brain quiet love, again, the body-to-body contact and the kiss of a loving mother triggers immediate neuroplasticity in and development. So here what you would see is oxytocin is being triggered in this baby's brain. That corticosteroids are dropping in the baby's brain here. That dopamine is being promoted here also as a result of this loving contact.
I believe, from what I experience, that you can get that same result from reconnecting with Mother Nature. She's a mother too. And she loves. You can just go outside, be, listen, and feel it. Get your feet on the ground and open your heart. You can breathe in deeply and breathe out. And this can be part of your daily meditation. Make it a practice every morning or every evening. And it will definitely nourish you in some way. However, since most of us are so disconnected from nature,
Depression is on the rise and considered by the World Health Organization the #1 form of disability worldwide. So there's the interpersonal disconnection fueling the mental health crisis, and the disconnection from nature is fueling the environmental crisis. Different types of psychedelic may also vary in their power to elicit changes in people's relationship to nature. So this was a survey study conducted by my friend and occasional collaborator, David Luke, and he surveyed people for their connection to nature, their pro-ecological awareness or concern, and then the types of psychedelic they were using. And he found from his work that psilocybin mushrooms seem to be top of the pile. And I had sort of an idea of like, that's interesting. Was this a quirk of his particular data set, or is this a general rule that applies? So we've just submitted the revisions on a paper combining 5 separate data sets to sort of look at the different psychedelics, because no one beyond Dave had really looked at that. This relationship does seem to hold true to psilocybin being top of the pile here. It seems to be, if you're going to sort of target any particular psychedelic for enhancing nature connectedness, that's the one to go for.
I think it's really fascinating from the work that has been done and is being done now, is that at least when it comes to something like psilocybin, evoking changes in people's relationship to nature or connectedness to nature, it doesn't matter that people are being administered psilocybin in otherwise cozy, to be fair, but concrete boxes. It doesn't even, people are being given synthetic psilocybin, not from obviously the fungus, lab-made psilocybin. Not that I really think that makes any difference, but that's just putting it out there. They're being given synthetic psilocybin in a kind of cozy, concrete sort of clinical box environment, but it doesn't seem to matter. As in, even when you're giving people that psilocybin, obviously when you're giving it to them, there's not any pre-flight plan where you're like, oh, this is going to affect or influence your relationship with nature. Like that's not on the pre-flight agenda, at all. So it's being kind of given blindly, if you can view it like that. Like, it's not being primed in any way, and obviously, bar other humans, there's not really any nature to speak of. And like, we can get all philosophical and go, well, everything's nature. And it's like, yeah, I get that argument, but I mean like, yeah, life, living,
lush green things, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that to me is really interesting, because I've kind of scoured the scientific literature on other nature connectedness enhancing interventions. A review paper was published just a few months ago, and these are things like residential stays in national parks, nature-based educational and engagement programs, things like this, and and they can produce like relatively sustained shifts in nature connectedness. Variable in their effectiveness, and they do take time and resources, and the more time and resources they take, the kind of longer the boost in nature connectedness you get. But what was kind of like, I thought, quite interesting from this review paper, having looked at all the studies myself, so I was like, okay, good, I'm on the right lines. Nobody's like assessed these interventions in terms of lasting effects beyond 3 months. Like 3 months is the upper limit. Now I'm a relative newcomer to this field through the kind of psychedelic on-ramp, but my thinking was like, kind of what's the point? I mean 3 months or less is small frickin' potatoes across a human lifespan. Yeah. Can we not do a bit better? Can we not be a bit more ambitious than that? And the fact that psilocybin can elicit these changes in people's relationship to nature when it's given in a context that's kind of like outside of nature is really quite special and unusual, because all those nature connectedness interventions I just mentioned, unsurprisingly, nature is very much the key focus, as you kind of would expect, but psilocybin doesn't even need that. And it seems that even a single experience can potentially elicit changes, and from some preliminary work, it seems like the changes persist as well. They don't sort of fade within that 3 month time window. So yeah, that makes me think, well, that's really interesting. But what happens if we actually used something like psilocybin as an applied nature connection in enhancing agent? So it's kind of part of a nature-based approach, setting context with nature-based stuff, kind of themes and content involved. And so it seems like there's great untapped potential yet to be kind of explored there, I think.
Let's zoom out for a second. So when astronauts view planet Earth from space, they tend to undergo a profound cognitive shift, a life-changing shift. And this sort of, this is known as the overview effect. It can be summarized as truly transformative experiences involving senses of wonder and awe, unity with nature, transcendence and universal brotherhood. And yeah, the astronauts that have this experience, they tend to sort of become much more ecologically aware and conscious. They sort of behold the incredible beauty of planet Earth, but also its fragility. As Belander said of this photograph, like, we came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is we discovered the Earth. Sort of a nice, interesting sort of psychedelic add-on to this story. Then Mary Prankster and writer Stuart Brand had some LSD in the winter of 1965 in San Francisco on a rooftop, and he sort of felt what he can almost perceive as the curvature of the Earth. And he sort of, it made him wonder in turn, why had no one taken a photograph from the Earth from space yet when we'd been to space? It seemed like, a logical thing to do. So he came down off his trip, but the idea stayed, and he sort of embarked on this campaign, sending badges to NASA and Congress, printed with, why haven't we seen a whole photograph of the Earth from space yet? And he felt that the release of such a photograph, this photograph, would help facilitate people to live more conscientiously with the planet. The concept of biophilia, which can be, considered the innate fondness we have for other life forms, the connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. So, nature connection. Self-identification with nature, or nature-relatedness. There's a substantial body of research now to show that what degree of nature connection is correlated with things like decreased anxiety, increased vitality, life satisfaction, happiness, and improved psychological well-being at the trait and state level. So it's a very important health predictor, indeed, on the individual level. But also, importantly, is that one's degree of nature connection is perhaps the single strongest psychological predictor of pro-environmental behavior. And it's interesting, so environmental knowledge, simply knowing about nature, is a much less strong predictor of this pro-environmental awareness. So that sort of emotional connection to one's environment, to nature, seems a very important part of the motivation for proactive behavior. This is taken from a collaborative study I was involved in with Imperial, the Center for Psychedelic Research, and among other things, we found a very, very clear and strong relationship between total lifetime experiences with psychedelics and people's mean nature-relatedness at baseline. We also found a strong association between that increase and well-being increases. And some of the positive predictors of the nature-relatedness increase were access to natural environments during the acute experience, and then ego dissolutions as well. And these are some sort of just brief participant accounts of how this connection might be experienced during the experience. Before, I enjoyed nature. Now I feel part of it. Before, I was looking at it as a thing like TV or a painting. You're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. Wouldn't it be good if we had tools that could induce the overview effect without the need of going to space, enhance our biophilia, and deepen our nature-relatedness? So, no prizes for guessing what those tools might be. They are, of course, the psychedelics, which have been used by some cultures for centuries or millennia. It's interesting to note that the great chemist, discoverer of LSD, inventor of LSD, Albert Hofmann, described profound feelings, like mystical feelings of nature connection in his younger days, like unity and oneness with nature. And when he subsequently experienced LSD, he described it as sort of producing this very identical state of connection and unity with the natural world. So this is a sort of testimonial from one of the people in the psilocybin depression study. And yeah, like Google Earth, I had zoomed out. For weeks afterwards, I was absolutely connected to myself, to every living thing, to the universe. And so this is nice. This is kind of insinuating that without the sort of the great cost and sort of rigmarole of going to space, that psychedelics can offer an alternative, perhaps more accessible route to a very similar perspective. An interesting study paper looking at the potential of self-transcendent emotions that arise during the psychedelic experience and the potential spillover effects they might have in your day-to-day waking life. So things like mystical experiences, ego dissolution, and these powerful self-transcendent emotional states seem to predict changes in nature connectedness. And it was proposed that maybe once you've had a big sort of emotional breakthrough or experience like that, you're more liable then to tap into those emotions, admittedly in a diminished capacity in your sober waking life. And that could partly underpin changes in nature connectedness, because these changes do seem to be sustained. And then as well, there's a few studies published recently. Well, there's a qualitative study assessing people who've had psilocybin therapy for smoking cessation, and then 2 more studies much more recently that seem to suggest that psychedelics can increase people's predisposition to experience awe.
Indeed, those are unforgettable experiences, and you can always come back to those memories.
Post-experience. So we know, we sort of kind of well established that awe is a big part of the acute psychedelic experience, but it seems that, yeah, people are more liable to experience awe post-experience, and that's potentially really interesting. Awe is a complex, interesting emotion and potentially a good therapeutic target as well. There was an interesting study conducted by Yale looking at nature immersion as a way of treating post-traumatic stress disorder in military veterans with PTSD. And of all the emotions associated with that experience, I think it was like 10 days spent in nature, in sort of quite pristine wilderness, it was the experience of awe that was central for the improvement in outcomes in that particular population. So perhaps you could kind of have like nature-assisted psychedelic therapy where awe could be a potential target.
Working with Amanita muscaria, it has brought back this nature connection, which I had with the forest. Riding bareback on a horse, just listening to the sounds. This was my beloved Jamaica. And I'm so grateful that I had this wonderful opportunity to look after her and be with her in the forest together. It was a beautiful bond. One of my most cherished teenage memories. And it gave me that beautiful inner peace. That was my teenage meditation, which pulled me through the struggling years of puberty. In 2016, I had a spontaneous, non-ordinary state of consciousness, close to the Glastonbury Tor. Just having a break in nature, lying in the grass. It was so profound when all of a sudden I was overcome with that sense of oneness, I felt unconditionally loved and cradled by Mother Earth, and I was the one loving Mother Earth. Amazing. I will never forget that. Since then, that deep connection has been rekindled a few years later. It was that mushroom, Amanita muscaria, which inspired me. It was like an inner pull to go back into the forest just for a walk. And now I do this on an almost daily basis. It has so reconnected me to Mother Earth.
And so there's a real lacuna in this area, and I think it could really push the envelope a little bit in terms of, psychedelics don't just have potential uses in for mental health conditions. I think even people so-called normal healthy volunteers, if you like, the functional neurotics can benefit potentially from these things for all kinds of issues like creative problem solving and enhancing connectivity and ecological consciousness. So I think creativity is a really important subject to explore.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this on the podcast a while ago, so people have probably heard this story before, but our teacher Lenny was chatting with Stan Groff, and this was, I don't even know, probably like 15 plus years ago, saying like, oh, isn't this exciting? Like, all this like research is starting to come back, and Stan said, a lot of it's been done in the mental health field, but the real potential here is in creativity. So Jim, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts around that comment.
Well, I was just kind of musing on, wouldn't it be nice if the research was on mental health? It isn't so far. It's, as we know, been medicalized, which is not what the indigenous uses for the past 2,000 years were. But what's wonderful is what the paper brings back is that that altered states is part of the human condition. And there are ways of inducing it. One we know is going to sleep. And that we all have been practicing. Another, obviously, is extreme fatigue, stress, etc. These are all areas where breakthroughs occur. Well, it's an important cultural topic, which is one of the questions is a cultural system producing an educational system that allows, that supports creativity and at which we can literally measure when we look at patents, and there are ways of measuring functional creativity. So we're looking at creativity functionally as well as theoretically.
I mean, yeah, and I would add, creativity in all its forms is considered perhaps one of the most highly valued and highly prized of human traits. I mean, it's a big part of the fuel that got us to where we are today, having this, conversation, each of us in different parts of the world, interconnected through the mycelial interwebs, and having this conversation now that's down to scientific technological creativity and innovation. And one of the aspects of creativity is allowing us to adapt to a changing environment, to a changing world. So any potential avenues at all, even if the promise of creativity isn't guaranteed, it doesn't need to be guaranteed. Even if there's the possibility of harnessing or enhancing creativity in some way, even the mere possibility, I think, makes this area kind of worthy of exploration.
The Celtic knot mandalas I create, they are mostly inspired by what I observe in nature. The colors and the shapes. So having reconnected to Mother Earth really also inspires creativity to flow. And what else is the flow state if not a merging with the environment, relaxing into it? Basically, losing that persona self and letting it do through you whatever comes through, and it becomes effortless. And you tap into something, and then you just get new ideas from somewhere.
You know, in shamanism, how shamans gain knowledge of the objects of studies is rather than being detached, you become that which you want to learn more about.
Yeah, this is something which underpins the whole of Amerindian cosmology, and Amerindian cosmology is underpinned by the use of psychedelics, you know, and that is, it's a totally different type of epistemology to that of Western science. Is that if you want to know something, you become that thing you want to understand. You know, you transform into it and you understand it from a first person perspective. It's like the ultimate kind of subjectivity. Not without it's, you know, problematic. It may not be a genuine kind of subjective enmeshing, but it gives you this kind of different insight. In the same way, the objectivity of science isn't completely objective either. You know, you can't really divorce yourself. But, you know, Western science aims to be objective and attempts to do science through this process. And yet, particularly where innovation and discovery is concerned, there may be a lot to be gained by having this more kind of subjective perspectivism of you know, transformation into the other, which we do see in altered states and creative problem solving, particularly with psychedelics. Merlin Sheldrake, in his recent book, he was a participant in one of our LSD trial. He had this experience. He was trying to work out 3 years of PhD research on the relationship between this fungus and a plant, and he still had no idea. And then, under the influence of LSD, he turned into the fungus and saw that his whole, you know, years of research, it turned on its head and looked at it in a completely different way. And so I think, you know, there's probably room in the way we do science for having this more kind of ultra subjective approach to it. At least in the kind of innovative kind of stage, you know, in the kind of what's the first stage of creativity? That kind of like the immersion stage where you kind of get your ideas, I think, and then you go away and test them, perhaps not in an altered state of consciousness, right, in a more objective way. But I think, you know, Western scientists cut ourselves off from that. That becomes completely taboo to do that kind of work. It's this kind of thing that never would go into a scientific research paper for us.
See, I think we have to acknowledge that the word scientism, meaning science as a religious doctrine, which you are punished for going outside of. And it's not much different from Catholic Orthodoxy or any religious orthodoxy that has as a doctrine that things outside it are either don't exist or are bad. Okay, and we all know that, I mean, I wish there was a nice term for parapsychology, but we know it's a derogatory term. Except that everyone has had experiences of it. When I was a first-year graduate student at Stanford and finding psychology truly limited because I had recent psychedelic experiences, I carried with me a little what's called a Zehner pack. It's a pack of 5 cards with 5 different symbols. It's used in standard parapsychology research. And every once in a while, when I was with my other graduate students, I would mention it and comment, and they would universally, you know, tell me what a stupid jerk I was and how silly this was, and, you know, grow up, Fadiman. And then I would just kind of wait, and someone then would say, you know, my grandmother, and they would tell this story of divination, of parapsychology, of talking with the dead, or whatever it was, and then someone else would chime in with someone, you know, the women in my family, and then I would just listen to these stories and put my cards away. So that right below the orthodoxy, and we were going to be the new priesthood of orthodoxy, was human experience. And those human experiences are much easier to accept if they're in your family. But you can't put them in a journal, because the journal is orthodoxy. And it's very clear. Having been rejected by a number of interesting journals, I can assure you that orthodoxy is alive and well and is a limitation. It's not evil. It's just their problem is not that they're not good at what they do. Their problem is that they don't acknowledge there are other ways. And that's simply silly.
I think if you know anything about hemisphere difference, that the left hemisphere is rather boring but reliable. It's like a decent accountant. It keeps good records, but it's not actually great company. And the left hemisphere is not, unbiased and unemotional. It's actually prone to anger and aggression. It's very far from being calm. It also tends to jump to conclusions more than the right hemisphere, which Ramachandran, a great neuroscientist, has called the devil's advocate. Anyway, what my research is over 30 years and my collaboration with John Cutting in the initial phases of that reveal is that these two manners of being in the world that these hemispheres bring for us are to do with the way in which we attend. Now, that may not sound very exciting. In fact, when I first realized that the basic thing here was attention, the penny didn't immediately drop. Just, well, attention, it could be memory, it could be, calculation, it could be anything. What's special about attention? Well, the answer is that attention is actually how our world comes into being. We can only know the world we experience, and how we experience that world depends fundamentally on the type of attention. So if you attend to something in one way, you see one thing. If you see it attend in another, you see something quite different. And everybody sees what they are interested in finding, and the way they attend makes all the difference. So basically, attention helps shape the world.
And therefore, if I could choose, I would prefer to live in a wooden cabin in the woods directly, always being surrounded by trees and nature. So I see this as a chance, and why everybody, not just depressed people in clinical settings, but more general for all who want to try it. They should have the opportunity and the access to these substances, of course used responsibly. I see it as a chance to turn this around and hopefully prevent that complete destruction of our beautiful planet Earth.